Hello, friends. Today's podcast question says, my children are 7 and 5, and they have not shown interest or asked many questions about where babies come from. How would you recommend I organically bring up the topic and tell them about sex without forcing it upon them? Would this talk include the mechanics or just a general idea? Really great question. And those of you who are faithful Foundation Worldview Podcast listeners, you know that we typically recommend that parents start talking with their children about sex around the age of 4. And we do this for 2 reasons. The first is what my friend Hillary Ferrer from Mama Bear Apologetics has labeled the expert theory, that whoever talks with us about a topic first naturally becomes the expert on that topic in our minds. And so we want our children to come to us with their questions, not out to the world. So it's important that we make sure that we have the first conversations with them about sex. The second reason that we recommend having the conversation or the first conversation so early is we want to make sure that we can frame things positively. We want our children's first view of sex to be one that is positive, where if we wait to talk with them about sex until they have already heard information or misinformation from friends or from some show or some other form of media, or if we wait until we encounter a homosexual couple or someone who is presenting themselves as the opposite gender and we have to backtrack, the first impression our child will have about sex is one that is negative. So for the sake of starting it off positive, which is how the biblical worldview presents sex, we need to make sure that we have those conversations with them before they're exposed to the ideas of the world. Now, this questioner says, what should we do if our children have not brought up questions? If our children don't ask us questions about where babies come from, should we bring up the topic of sex? And my answer to that question is yes. Again, as I said, around the age of 4, potentially the age of 5, it's important that we start having these first conversations about sex. Now, if you grew up and your parents had one awkward sex talk with you somewhere around the ages of 9 or 14, somewhere in that spectrum, you might be thinking, oh my goodness, it was so uncomfortable. It was so terrible. I don't want it to be like that for my child. And that's great. And the amazing thing is when we start talking with our children about sex when they are under the age of 9, usually there's only one person who feels awkward in the conversation, and it's us. Our children don't feel awkward talking about sex or sexuality at these young ages. We also don't need to make the first sex talk a big sit down moment. We can just plan, tonight after dinner, or when I'm tucking my child in bed, or, today when we're making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches together. You can have the first talk with them because you want sex to be something that they're comfortable coming to you with and asking you questions about. So rather than making it a big sit down moment, just make it something that happens naturally during the course of the day. Now, when you have these initial sex talks, I think that there's actually 3 different talks that are wise to have. First, have a talk that covers just the basics of male-female anatomy, okay, the basics of body parts. The second conversation, have a conversation that covers the basic mechanics of sex. And third, have a conversation that covers the basics of reproduction. Now, if you are wanting more help in these conversations, at Foundation Worldview, we actually just released a new series called God's Good Design for Sex. And this series is 3 videos. Each of the videos is under 10 minutes in length, and they cover the 3 things that I just mentioned: body parts, sex, and reproduction in developmentally appropriate and theologically accurate language. So if you use this series, what you can do is you can watch these videos alongside your child. You can allow us to say the uncomfortable things first so that you're experiencing it with your child, but you don't actually have to be the one who says the uncomfortable things first. You can say them second as you're having follow-up conversations with your child. Or you can watch the videos in this series, listen to the language that we use, the analogies that we give, and use that as a guide for how to talk with your child on these 3 topics: body parts, sex, and reproduction, on your own. So I highly recommend that you check out that God's Good Design for Sex series. Now, just some basics of what's covered in those videos and just basic conversations you can have with your child on these 3 topics. We'll look at that. So first, body parts. What I recommend that you do is you explain that God's good design for humans was to create us in his image as male or female. You can explain that male is a fancy word that means boy, female is a fancy word that means girl. Next, what you're going to want to do is you are going to want to just explain the basic words for male and female genitalia. So introduce the terms penis and vagina. Now, if you have multiple children and your children are opposite sexes, it will be easy for them to understand that. If you have a girl and then 2 years later you have a boy, they just understand while you're changing diapers, while you're bathing together, they understand that they have different body parts. If you have one child, or if you have all children of the same sex, what you can do is you can explain that for boys, their penis is the part of their body that they urinate with. And then you can say for girls, they don't urinate with their vagina, but their vagina is one of the parts of their body they wipe after urinating. Okay, so just keep things really basic. Then you can close by asking if they have any questions. Now you might be thinking, oh my goodness, Elizabeth, what if they have off the wall questions or really embarrassing questions? Here's the thing. No matter what their question is, you have control over your facial expressions and your tone of voice. So even if they ask you a really uncomfortable or off the wall or bizarre question, what you can do is you can smile and you can say, that is a really great question. I'm going to need some more time to think about how to answer that well. So we'll talk about that, tonight or tomorrow or whenever you would have time to do that. But you can always buy yourself more time by just smiling, affirming their question, and saying that you'll circle back to it later. Okay, so that's just basics of covering body parts. Second conversation, the basic mechanics of sex. I recommend state things simply. Okay, keep it simple. So a simple way to say this, what we say in the God's Good Design for Sex series is the husband places his penis inside of his wife's vagina. Okay, very simple. You can explain that God designed for this to feel good. And you can tell your child, if this sounds a little strange to you right now, that's okay, because sex is for marriage and it's going to be a long time before you can consider getting married. So you don't need to worry about this right now. And then again, close by asking if they have any questions. And again, don't freak out if they ask something awkward or inappropriate or off the wall. You can say, that's a great question. I'm going to need a little bit more time to think about it before I give you an answer. So we'll talk about that more tonight or tomorrow. Then the third conversation, cover the basics of reproduction. For this conversation, you'll need to introduce the term sperm and egg. And then you can very basically explain that when a man's sperm meets a woman's egg, a baby begins to grow inside of the woman. And then connect this to sex. Say that the way a man's sperm meets a woman's egg is when a husband and a wife are having sex. And again, close the conversation by asking if they have any questions. So I hope just by seeing those 3 basic things, covering body parts, covering basic mechanics, and covering the basics of reproduction, it doesn't need to be a big sit down thing. While you might feel a little bit nervous, it's if you're talking with a child who is ages 8 or under, they're probably not going to feel awkward about this. Only you are going to feel awkward about it. And again, if you have a child ages 8 or younger, highly, highly, highly recommend that you check out our God's Good Design for Sex series. You can either watch the videos alongside your child. Basically, what we do is just go into more detail and just more. We go to scripture, we go into some analogies and different things in the videos, and you can watch it with your child, or you can just watch those videos on your own and then use the language that we use in those videos to have these conversations with your child. Just really want to encourage anyone who is starting these conversations or considering starting these conversations with your children. These are such important ones to have, and I know that they can be really uncomfortable, but having these conversations early on is going to pay dividends in the future. So thank you for being intentional with what you're doing with your children. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. But if you have a question that you would like for me to answer on a future Foundation Worldview podcast, you can submit that by going to foundationworldview.com/podcast. My prayer for you as we leave our time together is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of His Son. I'll see you next time.